December 7, 1941. A Sunday morning like no other, or so it seemed. In Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the sun had risen on a sky so perfectly blue it looked unreal, almost painted. The warm tropical air carried the scent of salt hibiscus, and the quiet hum of a harbor waking to a lazy weekend. But beneath that serene surface, a storm was about to descend. Along Battleship Row, the mighty vessels of the U.S. Pacific Fleet rested in apparent invincibility. 7 battleships were moored side by side, colossal steel giants floating on calm waters. The USS Arizona, Tennessee, Maryland, and the formidable West Virginia, all silent, all asleep. The crews were beginning their day. On the West Virginia, among the sailors tidying up and serving breakfast, was a 22-year-old named Doris "Dory" Miller. Miller was a mess attendant, 3rd class. His official duties were mundane: collecting laundry, scrubbing dishes, serving meals. In a navy that had made explicit rules, he was forbidden from combat, forbidden from handling guns, forbidden from stepping outside the boundaries set for men of his race. Miller's battle station, if war came, was far below decks in the ammunition magazine. His role was to pass shells to the trained gunners, never to fire a shot. Yet, unbeknownst to him, a deadly plan was in motion. 4,000 yards away, a Japanese B-5 Nkate torpedo bomber cut through the morning haze, flying low over the water, torpedo in tow. The weapon it carried, an 1,800-pound Type 91 torpedo, was designed for destruction. But Pearl Harbor posed a problem. Its shallow waters, averaging just 40 feet, were thought to make torpedo attacks impossible. Conventional wisdom, held by the top naval minds in Washington and Hawaii, insisted the harbor was impervious. Experts had been proven wrong before, but never like this. Months earlier, Japanese engineers had solved the problem with ingenuity that seemed almost laughable in its simplicity. They attached wooden fins to their torpedoes, added a gyroscopic stabilizer, and created a device that could arm itself in the shallowest water. A weapon meant to bypass the assumptions of a complacent enemy, a torpedo designed specifically to kill battleships in Pearl Harbor. Far below the West Virginia's deck, Miller moved through the shadows of the ship, collecting laundry, unaware of the approaching storm. He had grown up in Waco, Texas, the son of a sharecropper, standing tall at 6 feet 3 inches and 200 pounds, a natural athlete, a football star, and a boxer. He had joined the Navy seeking adventure, a way to see the world, and perhaps a life beyond the narrow confines of segregation. Yet here, in 1941, he was confined to a world defined by racial prejudice, a man with the strength of a lion forced into the role of valet. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had embarked on what the world would later call an audacious gamble. Yamamoto, a strategist who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, knew the reality of the war before it began. Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against the United States. The plan, therefore, was a single devastating strike meant to cripple the Pacific Fleet and buy time, a strike that required secrecy, precision, and audacity beyond reason. By 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft lifted off from 6 carriers, crossing thousands of miles of ocean without radio contact, the pilots trained to attack a target they could barely see. Their mission: annihilate the U.S. battleships in a matter of minutes. Miller's day had started like any other. He moved through the galley, serving officers breakfast, polishing silverware, washing dishes. He was unaware that in mere moments his world would shatter. Above him, the alarms would soon sound. Explosions would tear steel, hurl men into the air, and transform the tranquil harbor into a living inferno. And beneath the hulls of those sleeping giants, Dory Miller would be forced to confront a truth the Navy had long denied. Courage does not wait for permission, and a single man could defy every expectation. At this moment, though, it was just morning. The sun rose. The harbor gleamed. The Pacific seemed calm. But 4,000 yards away, death was lining up its run, a silent, lethal predator flying at 40 feet above the water, poised to change history forever. Miller did not yet know it, but by the end of that morning he would face a choice no one thought he could handle. A choice that would test the very limits of bravery, challenge the racist policies of the U.S. Navy, and etch his name into history. And so, as the first klaxon of warning was about to pierce the tranquil air, Pearl Harbor slept, blissfully unaware that the impossible was coming. By 7:48 a.m., the calm of Pearl Harbor was obliterated. What had seemed like a tranquil Sunday morning erupted into unimaginable violence. From the sky came a wave of Japanese planes, diving low and fast, the roar of engines drowning out the tropical serenity. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters sliced through the air, their red insignia stark against the blue sky. The first explosions shook the water, the harbor, and the hearts of men who had believed themselves safe. On the USS West Virginia, Doris Dory Miller was below decks, deep in the belly of the ship. Some accounts say he was in the laundry, others place him in the galley. It hardly mattered. What mattered was that he was far from the battle, surrounded by steel, unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The first torpedo struck the West Virginia's port side. A deafening blast tore through the hull, throwing men into walls, flooding compartments with water and oil. The ship shuddered violently as if the very earth beneath it had shifted. One by one, additional torpedoes struck. 7 in total. The sixth disabled the rudder, leaving the massive battleship unable to steer, a sitting target for the relentless attack. Each impact brought fire, smoke, and chaos. Water surged through the decks, drowning men and destroying the ship's official battle stations. Miller's assigned role, the ammunition magazine deep below, was already submerged. Above him, the world had become a nightmare. Sailors scrambled in panic. Explosions erupted across the deck, sending splinters of steel and fire into the air. The USS Arizona, moored just behind the West Virginia, exploded spectacularly, its forward magazine detonating in a fireball that lifted the 33,000-ton ship hundreds of feet into the sky. The shockwave struck the West Virginia like the fist of God, knocking men off their feet and sending debris raining down on the decks. The officers and trained gunners, the so-called experts of the Navy, were dead or incapacitated. The Japanese planes strafed relentlessly, their machine guns ripping into crewmen. The anti-aircraft guns intended to defend the ship were silent, unmanned, or destroyed. The chaos was total. And then Dory Miller moved. The 200-pound heavyweight boxing champion of the ship, the man whose strength had once been confined to bare-knuckle deck fights and serving coffee, emerged into the smoke and fire. He did not hesitate. He did not think about the danger. He knew the ship was dying, the crew was being slaughtered, and his assigned role no longer existed. Miller fought his way up through the darkened, waterlogged passageways, feeling his way by touch and memory. Each step brought him closer to the main deck, where the inferno raged. Around him, men were screaming, bleeding, and falling. Water mixed with fuel floated on the deck, ignited by bombs and fires. The smell of burning metal, oil, and human flesh filled the air. When he emerged onto the deck, Miller was confronted by a scene of unimaginable horror. Sailors jumped into the burning water. Others lay motionless behind damaged anti-aircraft guns. Smoke obscured the sun. The sky was black with planes. Explosions continued, one after another. And yet, amidst the carnage, Miller's eyes caught the sight of Captain Mervyn Benyon, his commanding officer, lying wounded on the bridge, shrapnel tearing through his body. The captain, still conscious despite his mortal wounds, refused to leave, trying to direct the dying ship. Without hesitation, Miller ran. He and another officer lifted Benyon from the exposed bridge and carried him to a relatively safer area, dodging bullets and debris, ignoring the fire licking the deck. For this act alone, Miller defied every restriction the Navy had imposed on him. He was just a cook, forbidden from combat, yet here he was, moving a mortally wounded captain under conditions that would terrify trained soldiers. But Miller's courage did not end there. His gaze fell upon the 2 unmanned Browning .50 caliber machine guns, heavy, complex, and entirely unfamiliar. These were not weapons for someone like him. He had never been trained, never touched such a gun in his life. The gunners who should have fired them were dead. The Japanese planes were still strafing, dropping bombs, tearing the ship apart. Every second counted. A young officer nearby shouted at him, "Can you fire that thing?" Miller's honest answer was simple, "No, sir." The officer responded, "I'll load it. You fire." In that instant, the rules of the Navy, the restrictions of race and rank, the expert consensus that said men like Miller were incapable of combat, all of it vanished. There was only the living, the dying, and the choice in front of him. Miller gripped the twin handles, pulled the trigger, and unleashed a torrent of fire. Tracers, armor-piercing rounds, and incendiary bullets screamed into the sky. The deafening roar of the gun competed with the explosions around him. For 15 minutes, he fired without pause, targeting the incoming aircraft with instinct, courage, and fury. No one had ever expected a cook to do this. No one had anticipated a man denied training to hold a weapon and change the course of a battle. In those chaotic moments, Dory Miller became more than a mess attendant. He became a force, a wall of steel that Japanese pilots had not accounted for. Reports from survivors would later claim he shot down 2, 4, or even 6 planes. The truth may never be known, but what mattered was not the number. It was the act itself, the impossible courage, the forbidden defiance of a system designed to ignore him. By the time the attack ended, the West Virginia was dying. Flooded, burning, and listing, it had taken more torpedoes than any other ship that morning. Over 1,100 Americans were wounded. Hundreds were dead. And in the middle of that destruction, Dory Miller had done what no one expected, what no one thought possible. He had become a hero in a Navy that had long denied him the chance to be more than a cook. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a devastating victory for Japan, but in the midst of that tragedy, Miller's forbidden act had already begun to shatter the assumptions of a nation. The morning of December 7, 1941, had already become the most harrowing in U.S. naval history. Pearl Harbor, once serene and bright, was now a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and screaming men. The Japanese attack was relentless, precise, and devastating. Ships burned. Explosions shook the water. Sailors fought for their lives amid wreckage and debris. Amid the chaos, a single figure emerged, a 22-year-old mess attendant who had never fired a weapon in his life. Doris "Dory" Miller was about to perform what the Navy had long forbidden him to do. Miller's escape from the lower decks had been an act of sheer survival instinct. Flooded passageways, collapsing bulkheads, and the roar of the harbor could have trapped any man. Yet he navigated the twisting steel corridors by touch and memory, ignoring the panic around him. When he reached the main deck, the scene was apocalyptic. Sailors leaped into the burning water. Fires consumed the deck. The port side of the West Virginia was shredded by torpedoes. And above all, the sky was full of Japanese planes, diving and strafing as if the Pacific itself had been set on fire. On the deck, Miller's eyes caught sight of Captain Mervyn Benyon, lying mortally wounded on the bridge. Shrapnel from the Arizona's massive explosion had torn through the captain's body, but he refused to abandon his post. Without a thought for his own safety, Miller ran through the fire, grabbed Benyon, and carried him to relative safety. He was not trained for this. He was not expected to be brave in battle. He was, by the Navy's own regulations, merely a cook. But the line between expectation and necessity had vanished. And then he saw the guns. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted and ready, silent because the men who should have fired them were dead. They were heavy, complex, belt-fed, and entirely unfamiliar to Miller. No training, no prior experience, nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. To anyone else, the guns were instruments of death requiring skill and precision. To Miller they were a chance to fight back. A young officer, Lieutenant Anson White, noticed Miller eyeing the gun. "Can you fire that thing?" he shouted over the roar of battle. Miller's response was simple, "No, sir." White's answer was immediate, "I'll load it. You fire." In that moment, the Navy's entire system of restrictions and racial hierarchy dissolved. There were no rules, no restrictions, no mess attendant, or unfit for combat. There was only life, death, and the choice to act. Miller gripped the gun, felt its weight, and pulled the triggers for the first time. The roar was deafening. The gun coughed tracers into the sky, each round a defiance of the impossible. Miller had no aim, no target prioritization. He simply fired at the planes that threatened his ship, using instinct honed from years of boxing and physical strength. The rounds tore through the air, a wall of fire no Japanese pilot had anticipated. For 15 straight minutes, Miller continued. He fired as bombs detonated around him, as oil burned beneath his feet, as men screamed and ran for cover. The machine gun's belt-fed rounds hissed into the sky, each one a testament to courage that refused training. The untrained cook had become the most formidable anti-aircraft weapon on the West Virginia. Survivors later reported what seemed impossible. Some saw Miller hit 2 planes. Others claimed 4. A few even insisted he shot down 6. In the chaos, amid smoke, fire, and explosions, no one could know for sure. What was certain was that Miller's gun was a force that the Japanese had not counted on. A single man, forbidden to fight, standing his ground against expert pilots and advanced aircraft. Meanwhile, the ship continued to burn and flood. The West Virginia was sinking. The deck listed under water and fire, torpedo holes had ripped its hull apart, and trained officers and gunners were dead. Yet Miller remained, firing relentlessly until ammunition ran low. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. He was no longer a cook, he was the heart and hands of his ship's defense. In those moments, the Navy's assumptions shattered. Men who had never believed a black sailor could wield a weapon effectively now watched in awe. Racist policies, official restrictions, and expert consensus meant nothing against courage and instinct. Miller's Forbidden Act, the act that the Navy had long prohibited, had become the turning point of defense on the West Virginia. When the firing ceased, Miller helped other sailors navigate the wreckage. He guided wounded men toward safety, pulled them onto rafts, and assisted in evacuating the surviving crew. He checked on the captain he had saved, ensured others had escaped, and remained composed amid the carnage. The impossible had been done. A man denied the right to fight had not only survived but had defended his ship against overwhelming odds. The attack on Pearl Harbor would ultimately be a devastating victory for Japan. 18 ships were sunk or crippled. Thousands of Americans were dead or wounded. The Pacific Fleet had been struck a crippling blow. But amid the devastation, a single act of defiance stood out. Doris Miller, the mess attendant, had done what no one thought possible. He had manned a gun, fired with deadly efficiency, and proven that courage transcends training, rank, and race. This was not only heroism. It was the first crack in a system built to keep him invisible. The Forbidden Act had begun to challenge the Navy's assumptions, revealing that the measure of a man was not the rating on his enlistment papers, but the heart beating in his chest. Doris Miller's actions that morning would echo far beyond the decks of the West Virginia. They would become a story the Navy could not control, a legend the public would demand to hear. And the first step had been taken. The cook had taken the gun and in doing so had fired the first shot against prejudice as well as the enemy. The smoke hung thick over Pearl Harbor like a living, choking cloud. The roar of exploding shells and the crackle of fire mixed with the screaming of terrified sailors, creating a soundscape no man could have imagined. Amidst this chaos, a figure moved with purpose, though his hands had never held a weapon in battle. Doris Miller had just transformed from the ship's cook into the ship's last line of defense. The West Virginia was a floating tomb. Torpedoes had torn open its hull, floods claimed compartments below, and fires ran rampant across the decks. The Arizona had already exploded, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the sky, a terrifying monument to the destruction raining down upon Battleship Row. Every expert, every officer, every sailor trained in the art of war had been killed, wounded, or disabled. The anti-aircraft guns were silent, or they had been until Miller arrived. Miller's hands gripped the twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns. They were heavy, unyielding, and complicated. Ammunition belts hung like serpents, waiting to be fed into the roaring maw of the guns. He did not know how to lead a target. He did not understand ballistic trajectories or aiming at a moving plane. What he had was instinct, courage, and a will that refused to let his shipmates die without a fight. A young officer, Lieutenant Anson White, loaded the belts as Miller pulled the triggers. The guns came alive, spitting fire into the sky, tracers cutting through the smoke like streaks of silver lightning. Japanese dive bombers screamed toward the deck, strafing and dropping bombs in a deadly rhythm, yet Miller fired without pause. He did not wait for orders. He did not calculate range. He fired. And the impossible began to unfold. Reports from sailors in the smoke-filled decks would later attempt to quantify his heroism. Some said he hit 2 planes. Others insisted 4. A few survivors swore Miller brought down 6 aircraft, though the chaos made verification impossible. Each round he fired was more than a bullet. It was defiance against a Navy that had never trusted him to even hold a weapon, against a society that had denied him equality, and against an enemy that believed the Pacific would be theirs by morning. For 15 minutes, Miller held the guns. 15 minutes of deafening roar, fire, and explosions. 15 minutes in which a single cook, untrained and underestimated, became the only line of anti-aircraft defense on a battleship under siege. Bombs fell around him. Oil burned beneath his feet. Men screamed in agony and terror. And yet Miller did not flinch. He did not falter. He did not stop. He fired until the ammunition belts were empty, until his arms ached beyond human endurance, until the planes that had terrorized Pearl Harbor retreated or were destroyed. Around him, the officers who had once seen him as a mere mess attendant watched in astonishment. Men who had doubted his abilities now saw him as more than a cook. They saw a warrior, a man whose courage did not depend on rank or training, a hero born out of necessity. The rules of the Navy, the restrictions of race and position, all dissolved under the crucible of survival. But even in the middle of this extraordinary act, tragedy remained. The West Virginia was dying. Fires consumed decks, flooding destroyed compartments, and the massive ship was listing under the weight of torpedo damage. Hundreds of men had already died. And though Miller had saved lives and struck back at the attackers, He could not save the ship from the tide of destruction. It would eventually sink into the shallow harbor mud, a victim of the attack's unprecedented precision. In the immediate aftermath, the Navy was faced with a dilemma. Reports filtered up the chain of command, describing a mess attendant who had manned a gun and fired with remarkable skill. Some accounts spoke of planes destroyed. Others mentioned the rescue of the mortally wounded Captain Benyon. But no one wanted to face the implications of what had happened. How could a Navy built on segregation and strict racial roles accept that a black sailor had performed feats that officers and gunners could not? How could they acknowledge that a man forbidden to fight had, in effect, been the only defense the West Virginia had? Initially, the Navy tried to obscure the story. Early reports referred vaguely to an unnamed Negro mess attendant who had shown bravery. His identity was withheld. Newspapers received censored accounts. Admirals and political officers, fearing the disruption of social norms and the potential embarrassment to the Navy, attempted to control the narrative. They had survived the Japanese onslaught, but the truth, a single black sailor performing extraordinary acts of valor, was a problem they did not know how to manage. Meanwhile, survivors of the West Virginia began speaking quietly to one another. They told of the cook who manned the gun, of the way he had carried the captain through fire, of the wall of bullets he had unleashed against the enemy planes. These stories spread among the sailors, whispered at first, then shared with journalists who were determined to uncover what the Navy sought to hide. And so, in the midst of national tragedy, a forbidden hero had emerged. The attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated the Pacific Fleet. Ships were destroyed, lives lost, and the nation was thrown into mourning. But for those who had seen him act, Dorie Miller represented something more. Proof that courage could not be legislated, that valor did not respect race, rank, or expectation. The Navy would soon be forced to reckon with this truth. Public pressure, the persistence of journalists, and the testimony of survivors would eventually break the initial attempt to conceal his heroism. Miller's forbidden act, firing the guns, saving the captain, and standing against impossible odds, was no longer something that could be ignored. By the end of that day, as smoke continued to rise from the harbor and the West Virginia settled into its shallow grave, the impossible had already begun. The cook who had been forbidden to fight had not only defended his ship but had changed the way courage was measured in the Navy. And in the weeks and months to follow, the story of Doris Miller would begin to emerge, slowly at first, but inevitably unstoppable as the truth itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor left the United States stunned, its Pacific Fleet shattered, and its people in mourning. Ships had burned, sailors had died, and chaos had reigned. But amid the carnage, a singular act of courage had occurred. Dorie Miller, a 22-year-old mess attendant forbidden by Navy regulations from touching a weapon, had manned a .50 caliber machine gun and fired back at the Japanese planes, saving lives in the process. Yet, this remarkable heroism did not immediately translate into recognition. For the Navy and the political establishment, Dorie Miller's actions were a problem. They had long maintained strict racial hierarchies, relegating black sailors to mess attendants, stewards, and other non-combat roles. The idea that a black man could outperform trained gunners and save his ship was not only inconvenient, it was dangerous to the narrative they wanted to control. In the days after the attack, initial reports carefully obscured Miller's identity. Official statements praised an unnamed Negro mess attendant for bravery, but no name was released. It was a cautious attempt to acknowledge heroism without challenging the system. The black press, however, refused to let the story remain buried. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, which served the African American community, smelled injustice and a story of immense importance. Their editors understood that the Navy's reluctance to name Miller was not a mistake, it was deliberate. They sent reporters to uncover the truth, digging through survivor accounts, eyewitness testimony, and Navy records. One journalist in particular, Frank Bolden, tirelessly chased the story, asking the simple yet powerful question: who was this unnamed hero? The Courier's reporting ignited a spark. Headlines began to appear that hinted at an extraordinary act of valor by a black sailor, forcing the Navy to confront the growing public curiosity. African American communities across the country responded with excitement and pride, recognizing that one of their own had acted with unmatched courage when the nation had been shocked, terrified, and demoralized. Letters poured into the Courier, urging the Navy to reveal the man's identity. The story of the unnamed sailor was no longer just a news item, it became a symbol of black excellence, heroism, and the contradictions of a segregated military fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. Inside Washington, the Navy's expert system struggled. The bureaucrats, trained to enforce policy and maintain order, realized they had underestimated the public and the power of the black press. They had survived the attack itself, but this was a challenge of narrative control, something the Navy had never faced. They feared the implications. Acknowledging Miller's heroism openly would challenge segregation, expose racial prejudice, and force difficult questions about equality in the armed forces. Yet the facts were undeniable. Sailors had witnessed Miller carrying Captain Benyon, firing the gun, and standing as a singular line of defense while trained gunners lay dead or incapacitated. Pressure mounted. The NAACP, led by Executive Secretary Walter White, turned its full attention to the story. White, a man of influence and meticulous strategy, realized that Miller's heroism could not only correct an injustice but also serve as a weapon in the broader struggle for civil rights. He contacted Navy officials, held meetings with influential politicians, and ensured the story could not be ignored. The combined pressure of the black press, civil rights organizations, and public curiosity forced the Navy to act. 3 months after the attack on March 14, 1942, the Navy finally relented. Doris Miller's identity was released. The man who had been erased from reports, reduced to an unnamed mess attendant, was now publicly recognized. The story exploded. Headlines celebrated Miller's bravery, detailing how a cook with no combat training had manned a machine gun, fired at enemy planes, and rescued his captain. In African American communities, Miller became an instant legend, a real-life folk hero, a figure of courage who defied the odds and the system. Yet the recognition came with bittersweet irony. Though Miller had been publicly celebrated, he remained a mess attendant. The Navy had given him a medal for heroism, the Navy Cross, but had not changed his role aboard ships. His heroism had been acknowledged, but the systemic barriers that had limited him from the start remained. Miller became a symbol, paraded on war bond tours, photographed for posters, and held up as proof of black courage. But he had not asked to be a symbol. He had asked to fight, to serve alongside his fellow sailors, and to do his duty. Still, his actions forced change. The Navy, confronted with undeniable proof of black Americans' capability in combat, slowly began to adjust. Ratings that had been closed to black sailors, gunners, mechanics, radiomen, were now opened for training. Dory Miller's Forbidden Act had shattered the precedent. He had demonstrated not only personal bravery but the fallacy of institutional assumptions. A single act of courage had begun to challenge decades of systemic prejudice, creating opportunities that had previously been denied. For Miller, the accolades were secondary. He wanted to return to the fight. He wanted to stand beside his comrades and continue serving. The Navy, recognizing his symbolic value, initially kept him on war bond tours, but eventually he returned to sea duty, assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, an escort carrier in the Pacific. His legacy had begun, not just as a decorated hero, but as a man whose courage forced an entire system to reconsider its rules and assumptions. By acknowledging Dory Miller, the Navy had taken a step they had resisted for decades. The Forbidden Act, the act of manning a gun when he was never allowed to do so, was no longer a secret. The narrative had shifted. For the first time, the Navy could not deny that heroism had no color, courage no rank, and valor no restriction. Dory Miller had not only survived Pearl Harbor. He had survived the weight of systemic prejudice, navigated the suppression of truth, and emerged as a symbol of both personal and collective courage. His story was no longer forbidden. It was history, unavoidable, undeniable, and inspiring to all who would hear it. After months of recognition and public heroism, Dory Miller had grown restless. He had become the symbol of black American courage, a living legend who had stood alone against Japanese aircraft at Pearl Harbor. Yet the medals, the war bond tours, the photographs, and the speeches could not satisfy the sailor in him. Miller was not a politician or a celebrity, he was a warrior. He wanted to fight, to serve alongside his shipmates, to prove that his courage was not a one-time act, but a reflection of the dedication he felt for his country and his fellow sailors. The Navy, initially hesitant to send their most famous black sailor back into combat, eventually agreed. By 1943, Miller was assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, a small escort carrier operating in the Pacific. These ships were vital but vulnerable, small, lightly armored, carrying aircraft and bombs for the invasions of Japanese-held islands. They lacked the massive steel protection of battleships, making them floating targets in waters patrolled by enemy submarines. For Miller, this was exactly where he wanted to be. The Liscum Bay's mission was critical. She was part of a task group providing air cover and support for the Marines in the Gilbert Islands, specifically the invasion of Tarawa. Early November mornings were a whirlwind of activity on the carrier. Planes were being fueled, armed and prepped for sorties. Sailors moved with precision, yet the tension was palpable. Every man aboard knew that these small carriers were highly vulnerable, that a single torpedo or bomb could end them. And they were not wrong. On November 24, 1943, Thanksgiving Day, the Liscum Bay sailed in the pre-dawn darkness. The sea was deceptively calm, masking the presence of a Japanese fleet submarine, the I-175. Its commander, Tadashi Inada, was a master of patience and calculation. 4 hours he stalked the task group, slipping through the destroyer screen with deadly precision. He found his target, the Liscum Bay, silhouetted against the first hints of dawn, vulnerable and exposed. Below decks, Miller was at his post in the aircraft bomb magazine, surrounded by explosives, loading and passing ammunition to the gunners above. He was not in the cockpit. He was not flying planes. But he was critical to the survival of his ship and crew. The torpedoes struck with catastrophic effect. One slammed into the starboard side behind the engine room, directly where Miller was stationed. The explosion ripped through the vessel in an instant. Unlike Pearl Harbor, there was no chance to fight back this time. The Liscum Bay was smaller, more fragile, and completely unprotected against the kind of precision attack delivered by a skilled submarine commander. The oxygen-fueled Long Lance torpedoes detonated the bomb magazine. The ship erupted into a single, blinding fireball. Sailors on nearby ships were thrown off their feet by the blast. The carrier was obliterated within minutes, leaving nothing but flames, smoke and floating debris. Dory Miller's name would live on, but his body was never recovered. The sailor who had defied Navy rules and shot down Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor had now made the ultimate sacrifice. Hundreds of men went down with the Liscum Bay. The Pacific had claimed another hero. Yet even in death, Miller's story continued to resonate, for it was no longer just about survival or battle. It was about courage that transcended systemic barriers and the limitations imposed by society. His death marked the end of a man who had already become a legend. But it also symbolized the ongoing struggle against the systemic racism that had sought to limit him. Miller had fought not only the enemy abroad but the prejudice within his own military. His actions at Pearl Harbor had forced the Navy to reconsider racial restrictions, opening up new roles for black sailors. Now, his final sacrifice in the Gilberts cemented his legacy as a soldier of principle and a fighter who refused to be constrained by his official position. The Navy, which had once attempted to suppress his story, could no longer ignore his heroism. In the years that followed, Miller's name would become synonymous with bravery, determination, and the breaking of impossible barriers. Ships would bear his name. Honors would be posthumously awarded. And his story, once forbidden, would inspire generations of sailors and citizens alike. From Waco, Texas, to the burning decks of the West Virginia, to the explosive destruction of the Liscum Bay, Dory Miller's life was a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He had performed acts that the Navy said he could not. He had defied a system built to suppress him. And even when the Pacific took his life, he left behind a legacy that could never be erased. Dory Miller had not only been a hero of Pearl Harbor. He had become a symbol of what courage could achieve when it refused to be contained by rules, prejudice, or fear. The forbidden act of manning a gun when he was not allowed had set in motion a series of changes that would open doors for countless others. His final act, passing ammunition on the Liscum Bay until the very end, reflected the same dedication, the same bravery, and the same refusal to surrender to the impossible that had defined his life. In the Pacific, the ocean swallowed his body, but the story of Dory Miller would rise above it. It would challenge systems, inspire movements, and remind the world that heroism is not defined by rank, training, or color, but by courage, heart, and the willingness to act when everyone else hesitates. The Pacific swallowed the USS Liscum Bay and the sailors aboard her, including Doris "Dory" Miller. Yet even as the sea claimed his body, Miller's story refused to be buried. The cook-turned warrior who had defied orders, expectations, and systemic prejudice at Pearl Harbor had become an emblem of courage and determination. His life, his actions, and his ultimate sacrifice would resonate far beyond the decks of any single ship, echoing through the corridors of the United States Navy and into the hearts of generations to come. After the Navy finally acknowledged Miller's heroism in March 1942, awarding him the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, the nation began to see him not merely as a soldier, but as a symbol. He had performed the impossible. He had fought back when no one expected him to, saved his captain under fire, and manned a weapon he was forbidden to touch. In a segregated Navy, In a country still riddled with racial prejudice, this was revolutionary. The recognition was more than ceremonial. It was a challenge to a system that had long undervalued Black Americans' contributions to the military. Yet the Navy, cautious and calculated, initially used Miller's fame for public relations. He was sent on war bond tours, paraded through cities like New York, Chicago, and his hometown of Waco, Texas. Posters depicted him as the hero of Pearl Harbor, urging citizens to invest in the war effort. There was irony in this recognition. The Navy lauded him as a symbol while he remained a mess attendant, restricted by the very rules his heroism had exposed as unjust. He was celebrated, yet still confined by the system. Even so, the Dorie Miller effect was undeniable. His actions forced the Navy to confront the outdated, discriminatory practices that had limited Black sailors to menial roles. By the end of 1942, the Navy finally opened other ratings to Black sailors, allowing them to train as gunners, mechanics, radiomen, and more. A single forbidden act, a cook taking control of a machine gun during a surprise attack, had shattered the barriers of institutional prejudice. Miller had not only defended his ship, he had fired the first bullet in a war against systemic racism within the Navy. When Miller returned to combat aboard the USS Liscum Bay, he reaffirmed his heroism. Though he would never survive the attack, his final actions reflected the same courage that had defined Pearl Harbor. Passing ammunition, ensuring gunners were prepared, and standing ready in the bomb magazine until the very end, Miller exemplified selfless service. His death was tragic, yet it cemented his legacy as a man who had defied expectations not once, but twice, facing impossible odds with unmatched bravery. In the decades that followed, the Navy and the nation continued to honor him. In 1973, a 4,100-ton frigate was commissioned as the USS Miller, ensuring that his name would sail the seas long after his own life had been claimed by war. But the recognition did not stop there. In 2001, the Navy announced a historic and unprecedented honor, the naming of a Gerald R. Ford-class nuclear-powered supercarrier as the USS Doris Miller. This carrier, the most powerful and advanced warship in human history, would bear the name of a man who had once been forbidden to fight. He was the first enlisted sailor and the first African American to receive such an honor. A supercarrier, a floating fortress of modern naval power, symbolically carried the legacy of a cook who had defied the impossible. The naming of the USS Doris Miller represented more than tribute. It was a rebuke of the systems that had tried to suppress him, a recognition that heroism transcends rank, color, and expectation. Miller's Forbidden Act had long-term consequences. It reshaped Navy policy, challenged societal prejudices, and inspired countless individuals who had previously been told they could not achieve greatness. Schools, public buildings, and memorials also bore his name, preserving his story in both military and civilian memory. Miller's legacy is not merely historical, it is moral. He proved that courage does not require permission, that heroism can emerge in the most unlikely individuals, and that standing against impossible odds can change not only a moment, but an entire system. He showed that even in a world defined by rules, walls, and discrimination, one person's actions could rewrite the expectations of an institution and inspire generations. Today, Dorie Miller's story continues to teach lessons of bravery, equality, and persistence. From the steel decks of the West Virginia to the inferno of the Liscum Bay, to the hull of a nuclear supercarrier bearing his name, his life reflects a singular truth. Extraordinary courage is not reserved for those with rank, training, or privilege. It belongs to anyone willing to act when the system says they cannot. Dorie Miller's Forbidden Act, manning the guns at Pearl Harbor, was only the beginning. His posthumous recognition, the opening of new opportunities for Black sailors, and the eventual naming of ships in his honor demonstrate how one man's courage can ripple through history. His story reminds us that heroism is sometimes inconvenient, often dangerous, and always transformative. It is not just a tale from World War II, it is a living testament to the power of action, conscience, and the unyielding human spirit. From a cook forbidden to fight to a supercarrier carrying his name, Dorie Miller's journey is a story of courage that could not be silenced, a forbidden act that became a permanent part of history, and a legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and illuminate the path for those who dare to defy the impossible.